Before the fracture, the world of the X-Men presents itself as a managed territory, a school disguised as refuge, a mansion functioning as border, sanctuary, and watchtower at once. The promise is order through discipline, survival through restraint, harmony negotiated rather than seized. Power exists, but it is framed as something to be contained, supervised, softened for public view. This is a world that believes visibility can be controlled, that danger can be educated out of existence, that moral authority can remain centralized without becoming coercive. The rules are unwritten but rigid. Mutants are allowed to exist so long as they do not dominate the landscape. They may be powerful, but they must not rule. They may be exceptional, but never assertive. The ideal is integration without disruption. The cost of belonging is self-regulation. Strength must apologize for itself before it acts. This moral architecture is not neutral. It is a structure designed to soothe the surrounding world more than to protect those inside it. Within this architecture stands Scott Summers. He does not arrive as a rebel or a visionary. He arrives as alignment, straight posture, measured speech, eyes always forward, even when hidden. He is shaped early by loss, but also by instruction. His trauma is not chaotic, it is directional. He is taught that power requires structure, that emotion must be subordinated to function, that leadership is not about desire, but about bearing weight others cannot carry. He learns to stand at the center of the room without becoming its voice. Cyclops is not built to be loved. He is built to hold the line. Around him, other forces take shape. Charles Xavier presides from above, projecting calm like a ceiling meant to prevent collapse. His authority is soft-spoken, persuasive, deeply invested in the belief that reason can outpace fear. He believes the center can hold if it remains morally elevated. Eric Lencher stands at the perimeter, forged by history into resistance itself. He sees borders not as safeguards, but as traps. To him, survival is movement, pressure, the refusal to yield ground. These figures are not merely characters. They are gravitational fields. Each bends the moral terrain around them, pulling others into orbit. The school is not just a place of learning. It is a stage where incompatible visions of the future rehearse their arguments under the guise of mentorship. Every lesson carries an echo of conflict that has not yet declared itself. Scott Summers grows inside this tension like a structural beam placed where the strain will eventually peak. He internalizes the values of restraint, but he also sees the cost. He watches missions escalate while the rules remain static. He sees enemies adapt while doctrine stays pristine. He notices that survival requires decisions made faster than consensus allows. He does not articulate this at first. He absorbs it. Pressure accumulates quietly. The world outside the mansion does not soften with time. It hardens. Registration acts, surveillance programs, public fear cycles through new vocabulary but the same impulse. Control what you cannot trust. Label what you cannot understand. The arena expands. Mutant kind becomes a symbol contested by politicians, media, and crowds who never see the battlefield but vote on its consequences. The spotlight is never neutral. It amplifies threat more easily than nuance. Inside this expanding arena, neutrality becomes performative. Choosing not to act begins to function as an action itself. Every delay has a cost, even if that cost is distributed quietly among the most vulnerable. Scott begins to see that the moral center is not fixed. It drifts according to who is willing to defend it with force when rhetoric fails. Cyclops is often described as rigid. What is missed is that rigidity is sometimes the shape necessity takes under pressure. He is not driven by ideology. He is driven by calculus. How many lives does restraint protect today? How many does it endanger tomorrow? These questions do not produce applause. They produce isolation. The hatred directed at Scott Summers does not originate solely from his decisions. It emerges from what he represents. He is the figure who refuses the comfort of moral spectatorship. He does not allow others to believe they are innocent bystanders to history. When he acts, he reveals that choices were always being made, even when disguised as patience or hope. This is why the conflict around him feels disproportionate. It is not just about tactics. It is about the collapse of a shared illusion. That power can be held without being exercised. That leadership can exist without coercion. That survival can be negotiated indefinitely. The early world of the X-Men depends on these beliefs. They form its foundation. Scott Summers begins to strain them simply by standing where the weight converges. He does not seek the center, it is assigned to him. Leadership settles on him like armor that cannot be removed without exposing everyone else. Before the open break, before factions and declarations, the tension already governs behavior. Conversations become shorter. Trust narrows. Lines are drawn invisibly across rooms, across teams, across philosophies that once shared language. The arena contracts inward even as the external world grows more hostile. Pressure seeks release. Cyclops does not yet stand opposed to everyone, not openly, but the architecture of opposition is already in place. He is positioned at the fault line where ideals meet consequence, where patience meets extinction, where belief collides with reality. The coming fracture will be narrated as betrayal, as extremism, as loss of moral clarity. But beneath those labels lies something simpler and more unsettling, a system reaching the limits of its own restraint. A leader discovering that the center cannot hold without becoming something it was designed to resist. This is not the story of a fall from grace. It is the story of gravity asserting itself. Scott Summers enters the narrative not as a child discovering power, but as a structure built around it. His origin is not defined by desire or curiosity, but by containment. From the moment his abilities emerge, they arrive as excess force without an internal break. Vision becomes weapon before it becomes sight. Perception itself turns hazardous. What others experience as an extension of self, Scott experiences as a liability that must be managed every waking moment. His earliest psychological lesson is not empowerment, but suppression with purpose. The loss that follows is not only familial, it is ontological. His body no longer belongs fully to him. Every interaction carries risk. Every lapse threatens catastrophe. Where others learn impulse control as a social skill, Scott learns it as survival. This shapes a personality oriented toward vigilance, planning, and restraint. He does not trust spontaneity, not because he lacks imagination, but because imagination without structure feels like collapse. Charles Xavier offers him meaning in exchange for discipline. The school becomes more than refuge. It becomes a framework that transforms fear into function. Scott is given rules, hierarchy, mission. He is taught that power can be justified if it is subordinated to a moral project larger than the self. This is not indoctrination in the crude sense. It is alignment between a wounded psyche and an ideology that promises control without corruption. Cyclops becomes the perfect student because he already lives inside the logic Xavier preaches. Control equals safety. Order equals survival. Sacrifice is not tragedy, it is duty. In this early phase, Scott does not question the architecture because it mirrors his internal landscape. The institution feels like an externalization of his own coping mechanisms. The center holds because he needs it to. Around him, Others arrive carrying different relationships to power. Jean Grey experiences ability as expansion, an opening into intimacy and connection that threatens to eclipse the very boundaries Scott relies on. Logan embodies instinct unfiltered, violence that emerges not from calculation but from reflex and history. Aurora Monroe carries authority shaped by reverence and balance rather than command. These figures do not merely contrast Scott. They destabilize him by existing comfortably in modes he cannot inhabit without fear. Scott adapts by becoming functional rather than expressive. He becomes reliable. He becomes the one who executes plans without hesitation. He absorbs responsibility like gravity absorbing mass. Over time, this reliability hardens into expectation. Others lean on him. Leaders delegate to him. The system begins to rely on his capacity to carry weight silently. This is not empowerment. It is conscription into inevitability. Xavier remains the symbolic center. His authority is rooted in persuasion, moral elevation, and a belief that visibility can be managed through example. He operates from above the fray, trusting that if the institution remains virtuous, history will eventually align with it. This belief depends on time. It assumes patience will be rewarded. It assumes enemies will tire before extinction arrives. Scott operates closer to the ground. He sees missions fail. He counts casualties. He watches patterns repeat. The distance between ideology and outcome becomes measurable. He does not yet articulate dissent, but dissonance accumulates. The system asks him to act decisively while maintaining an image of restraint that increasingly feels performative. He is told to lead, but not to redefine the terms of leadership. Magneto exists as the counterpole long before Scott confronts him ideologically. Eric Lencher embodies the consequence of waiting too long. His worldview is forged by annihilation, not fear. Where Xavier believes in convincing the world, Magneto believes in surviving it by force. To Scott, Magneto is both warning and mirror. A figure who refused restraint and became monstrous in the public imagination, yet undeniably effective in preserving mutant autonomy. This triangulation creates a psychological trap. Xavier represents moral authority without urgency. Magneto represents urgency without restraint. Scott stands between them, tasked with operational leadership while denied philosophical authorship. He executes a vision he increasingly doubts, while being judged against a specter he fears becoming. The broader cultural environment intensifies this pressure. Mutants are no longer curiosities. They are political symbols. Legislation, surveillance, and public fear transform abstract prejudice into concrete threat. The territory narrows. Safe spaces become conditional. The school feels less like sanctuary and more like a holding pattern. Every compromise buys time, but time no longer feels abundant. Scott begins to recognize a structural flaw. The system is designed to react, not to preempt. It responds to crisis after it erupts, always one step behind forces that do not share its restraint. This asymmetry becomes lethal. Enemies exploit hesitation. Allies suffer consequences. The moral high ground starts to resemble exposed terrain without cover. This realization does not radicalize Scott immediately. It isolates him. He continues to perform his role, but his internal map changes. Leadership becomes less about executing orders and more about anticipating collapse. He starts thinking in terms of worst-case scenarios rather than ideal outcomes. This shift is subtle, but it alters his relationship to authority. He begins to see Xavier not as infallible center, but as a figure bound by his own investment in appearing benevolent. The psychic events that ripple through mutant history accelerate this transformation. Genosha, decimation, near extinction compressed into moments. The illusion of gradual progress shatters. Survival becomes statistical rather than philosophical. Numbers matter. Every loss feels irreplaceable. The future contracts. Scott's response is not grief alone. It is recalibration. He recognizes that leadership in scarcity cannot resemble leadership in abundance. Moral frameworks designed for growth falter under collapse. The rules that once preserved life now risk erasing it through inaction. This is the point where his divergence becomes irreversible. Importantly, Scott does not abandon ethics. He redefines their application. Protection shifts from symbolic coexistence to material survival. Visibility shifts from appeasement to deterrence. He does not seek domination, but he accepts the necessity of force as communication. Power must be legible to those who threaten existence. Otherwise it remains hypothetical. This reorientation places him in direct tension with nearly everyone around him. Allies accustomed to moral clarity interpret his pragmatism as coldness. Former mentors read his decisiveness as betrayal. Rivals seize on his actions as proof of inherent danger. Scott becomes a contested territory. Every group projects its fears onto him. He becomes the screen upon which unresolved anxieties about power, responsibility, and leadership are displayed. The hatred that follows is not merely personal. It is structural. Scott embodies the uncomfortable truth that survival demands choices no one wants to own. By making them visible, he disrupts the fantasy that goodness alone can protect the vulnerable. He forces the community to confront the cost of its ideals when stripped of time and safety. In this sense, Cyclops is not opposed because he is wrong. He is opposed because he is early. He acts before consensus catches up to necessity. He accepts the burden of being misunderstood rather than allowing the system to drift toward annihilation while maintaining moral self-satisfaction. The psychological foundation of the conflict is now set. Scott Summers is no longer simply a leader within the structure. He is a stress test for the structure itself. His decisions will expose what the system values more: its image or its survival, its ideals or its future. From this point forward, neutrality collapses. The field organizes around response to his leadership. Support becomes conditional. Opposition becomes moralized. The arena narrows further. The conflict will no longer remain latent. It will take shape. The first visible shift does not arrive as revolution. It arrives as adjustment. Scott Summers begins to act as if collapse is not hypothetical. Missions change tone. Objectives tighten. Risk tolerance narrows. He prioritizes extraction over symbolism, survival over optics. These decisions appear minor in isolation, but together they alter the geometry of leadership. The team no longer moves as an expression of values alone. It moves as a response to threat vectors that refuse to wait for moral consensus. This is where friction begins. The X-Men were never just a tactical unit. They were a moral performance. Every public action carried representational weight. Scott's recalibration disrupts that function. He treats the battlefield as territory rather than stage. He stops assuming witnesses will interpret restraint as virtue. Instead, he assumes adversaries read hesitation as weakness. This assumption changes everything. Force becomes message. Readiness becomes language. The break with Xavier's legacy does not come through defiance. It comes through necessity. Charles remains committed to a vision that requires time, persuasion, and the gradual softening of fear. Scott no longer believes time is neutral. Every delay now feels like surrender by increments. When extinction looms statistically, patience ceases to be ethical. It becomes indulgent. Scott does not say this aloud. He simply acts accordingly. Events accelerate. Mutant populations shrink. Safe zones are compromised. Enemies adapt faster than institutions reform. Scott's leadership shifts from reactive coordination to anticipatory defense. He centralizes command. He makes decisions that bypass deliberation. Each choice increases efficiency and erodes trust. The system begins to polarize around his authority. Those who feel protected accept the cost. Those who feel sidelined resist it. This is the moment where Scott becomes legible as a threat, not only to enemies but to allies. His leadership style exposes an uncomfortable asymmetry. He is willing to accept responsibility without requiring validation. This removes a psychological safety valve for others. If Scott is right, then previous restraint was not moral superiority. It was avoidance. That implication provokes resentment. Opposition hardens. The narrative frames these developments as extremism. But extremism implies excess beyond necessity. What Scott exhibits is compression. He operates under scarcity, where margins vanish. The moral vocabulary surrounding his actions fails to account for context. Words like authoritarian and militant circulate because they are familiar. They simplify anxiety. They transform structural fear into personal blame. Internally, Scott absorbs the backlash without retreat. This is critical. He does not seek to persuade detractors emotionally. He understands persuasion as secondary to outcome. This further alienates him. Leadership without reassurance reads as cold. Silence reads as arrogance. In truth, Scott is conserving energy for decisions that cannot be deferred. He is no longer managing perception. He is managing survival curves. The symbolic center shifts. Xavier's absence, whether physical or ideological, leaves a vacuum that Scott fills by default. But he fills it without the soft architecture of charisma. He rules through function. Orders are clear. Lines are drawn. The organization becomes more efficient and less comfortable. This efficiency saves lives and fractures identity. The X-Men cease to be an ideal. They become an apparatus. This transformation forces every member to confront their own relationship to power. Those who thrived under ambiguity feel constrained. Those who feared chaos feel anchored. Scott does not adjust to accommodate either response. He treats variance as noise. The mission dictates alignment. This approach is brutal in its clarity. It strips away the illusion that unity can be maintained without shared risk tolerance. Public perception follows internal fracture. Media narratives sharpen. Cyclops becomes shorthand for militant mutation. His image is flattened into silhouette and visor, a figure associated with escalation. The nuance of context is lost. Visibility amplifies fear. The more he acts decisively, the more decisiveness itself becomes the threat. This feedback loop reinforces his position. If he is already perceived as enemy, restraint offers no protection. Scott recognizes this dynamic and stops resisting it. This is not surrender to villainy. It is strategic acceptance. He understands that identity has already been assigned. The question becomes whether to operate effectively within it or attempt rehabilitation that costs lives. He chooses the former. The mask hardens. The role crystallizes. Opposition within the mutant community intensifies. Former allies accuse him of becoming what they feared. They invoke Magneto as cautionary specter. Scott listens without flinching. He sees the parallel and accepts the risk. What others read as dissent, he reads as convergence with reality. The difference between him and Magneto, in his mind, is not force but aim. He seeks continuity, not domination. But intention does not soften impact. This stage of the conflict establishes the core dilemma. Scott's actions work. They prevent losses. They deter attacks. But they also erode the shared myth that morality alone can shield the vulnerable. The community is forced to choose between symbolic innocence and material survival. Many choose innocence. Scott chooses survival. The polarization is now structural. Neutrality becomes impossible because the system itself has changed. Every action affirms or resists Scott's approach. Silence becomes endorsement or opposition by default. The arena narrows further. Lines harden. Trust fragments. What emerges is not tyranny, but inevitability. Scott Summers does not impose his vision through persuasion. He allows reality to validate it. Each crisis that confirms his calculus deepens the divide. Each life saved under his command becomes an indictment of what came before. This is why forgiveness becomes unlikely. To forgive Scott would be to admit prior failure. The conflict has taken shape. It is no longer about tactics or temperament. It is about whether leadership exists to preserve ideals or to ensure continuity when ideals fail. Scott stands firmly in the latter position. He does not claim righteousness. He claims necessity. The system responds by tightening around him or pushing him out. Either outcome accelerates collapse. The pressure continues to rise. The second phase begins not with new enemies, but with the community turning inward, attempting to reclaim a center that no longer exists. The fault line widens. The second phase begins when opposition stops arguing about methods and starts contesting legitimacy. The question shifts quietly but decisively. It is no longer whether Scott Summers is effective. That answer has already been delivered by outcomes no one can easily deny. The question becomes whether effectiveness itself is allowed to redefine authority. This is where the conflict deepens from disagreement into structural fracture. Leadership had once flowed downward from a symbolic center. Xavier's presence functioned like a crown that did not need to be worn. Authority was ambient, distributed through trust in the ideal it represented. Scott's rise disrupts this architecture. He does not inherit the crown. He renders it obsolete. His authority emerges horizontally from crisis to crisis, validated not by moral elevation, but by results that prevent collapse. This makes him illegible to those invested in the old structure. Resistance organizes itself around memory. The past becomes weaponized. What the X-Men were becomes argument against what they are becoming. Scott is accused of eroding identity, of replacing vision with force. These accusations are not entirely wrong. They are incomplete. Identity built under protection cannot survive unchanged under siege. Scott understands this. Others cling to form because form feels like continuity. He recognizes it as inertia. The emergence of schisms follows predictable patterns. Some detach quietly, seeking smaller territories where the pressure feels manageable. Others confront Scott directly, framing his leadership as moral failure. These confrontations are charged less by strategy than by wounded expectation. Scott was never meant to become this figure. He was supposed to remain executioner, not architect. His refusal to stay in that role feels like betrayal of an unspoken contract. Internally, Scott's psychology tightens further. Isolation becomes operational. He limits emotional access not out of cruelty but efficiency. Every emotional appeal risks delay. Every delay risks lives. He is not numbing himself. He is prioritizing bandwidth. This distinction is lost on those who experience his distance as abandonment. Leadership under collapse requires asymmetry. Not everyone carries the same weight. Scott accepts this unevenness. Others resent it. The The return of Magneto into proximity sharpens the symbolic stakes. Where once Magneto existed as external threat, he now becomes uneasy mirror. Both men operate under the logic of deterrence. Both accept violence as communication. The difference lies in orientation. Magneto rules through domination of the field. Scott seeks to stabilize it long enough for continuity. But from the outside, the distinction blurs. Power erases nuance when observed from a distance. This convergence terrifies the community more than open hostility ever did. If Cyclops and Magneto occupy adjacent territory, then the moral map collapses. The old binary dissolves. Good and evil no longer align cleanly with restraint and force. Instead, the field reorganizes around competing interpretations of necessity. This destabilization is intolerable to those who relied on clear symbolic anchors. Public narratives accelerate this collapse. Media simplifies the conflict into familiar silhouettes. Cyclops becomes the militant leader who lost his way. Sound bites replace context. The spotlight flattens complexity. Every action is reframed as escalation. The fact that Scott operates in response to constant threat disappears beneath the image of a visor firing into darkness. Visibility amplifies fear. Fear demands villains. Scott understands the mechanics of this amplification. He does not attempt to correct it. Counter-narratives would require transparency he cannot afford. Revealing internal calculations would expose vulnerabilities. He accepts misrepresentation as collateral. This acceptance further alienates him. Silence is interpreted as confirmation. The echo chamber tightens. Within the mutant population, polarization becomes identity. Alignment with Scott signals acceptance of harsh realities. Opposition signals fidelity to an older myth. Communities fracture along these lines. Trust becomes conditional. Loyalty becomes performative. The social fabric stretches thin. Scott's leadership no longer merely protects bodies. It reshapes belonging. This reshaping carries cost. Those who oppose him experience his presence as occupation rather than protection. He becomes the wall they press against when seeking reassurance. His refusal to soften reinforces their narrative of him as tyrant. Scott does not counter this perception. He does not have time to manage how resistance feels. He manages where it goes. Boundaries are enforced. Lines are held. The psychological toll accumulates quietly. Scott's internal world narrows. He no longer imagines futures far beyond survival. Vision compresses to horizon. This is not despair. It is focus. But focus of this intensity consumes space once occupied by relational complexity. He sacrifices inner elasticity to maintain external stability. The cost is personal, but he treats it as acceptable loss. The moment that crystallizes opposition arrives when Scott chooses decisively between symbolic unity and strategic necessity. A line is crossed, not because it was previously unimaginable, but because it was previously unacknowledged. By acting without consensus, Scott confirms what many feared, that the center has shifted from collective ideal to singular command. The act itself matters less than what it reveals. From this point, reconciliation becomes structurally impossible. To accept Scott's leadership would require reconfiguring moral identity around survival under siege. To reject it would require confronting the fragility of ideals preserved through his actions. Neither option allows comfort. The system fractures because it cannot integrate both truths simultaneously. Scott does not respond to this fracture with regret. He responds with consolidation. He recognizes that partial authority invites collapse. He reinforces command, not out of hunger for control, but because fragmented leadership under pressure multiplies casualties. The more opposition grows, the more centralized his decisions become. This feedback loop appears authoritarian from the outside. From within, it feels like containment of chaos. The second phase ends with a paradox fully exposed. Scott Summers has become the figure everyone reacts to. Even those who oppose him define themselves in relation to his choices. He occupies the gravitational center he never sought. The arena orbits him. This is the moment when hatred solidifies. Not because he failed, but because he succeeded in making evasion impossible. The conflict has now surpassed disagreement. It has entered the realm of identity. Scott is no longer just a leader making hard choices. He is the embodiment of a future many are unwilling to imagine, yet increasingly unable to prevent. The third phase will not be about escalation alone. It will be about consequence. The third phase unfolds not as explosion, but as compression. By this point, the system has already reorganized around Scott Summers, whether it admits it or not. Power no longer disperses through dialogue or tradition. It concentrates where decisions are made fastest and consequences are absorbed most fully. Scott becomes less a commander issuing orders and more a load-bearing structure holding together a field under constant stress. This is where consequence begins to outpace intention. Scott's decisions continue to preserve lives, but they also redefine what leadership looks like under permanent threat. The X-Men no longer resemble a moral vanguard moving history forward through example. They resemble a fortified perimeter maintaining continuity against erosion. Territory matters now. Borders matter. Control of space becomes synonymous with survival. The symbolic school fully transforms into an operational center. What troubles many is not the shift itself, but its permanence. Emergency measures were once imagined as temporary deviations from an ideal path. Under Scott, deviation becomes the path. The language of exception dissolves. There is no return to baseline because the baseline no longer exists. The world does not de-escalate. Threat does not recede. In this environment, restraint without leverage becomes self-erasure. Scott understands this with brutal clarity. He stops framing choices as temporary sacrifices and begins treating them as structural commitments. This marks the true point of no return. When leadership stops waiting for redemption, it accepts responsibility for shaping the future rather than surviving toward it. Scott steps fully into authorship, even as others accuse him of abandoning the script. The community responds by hardening its narratives. Those opposed to Scott begin to frame his leadership as inevitability corrupted rather than necessity embraced. He becomes symbol of what happens when fear governs action. This interpretation is emotionally coherent, but strategically incomplete. Fear does govern action. The question is whether it governs blindly or with discipline. Scott chooses the latter. The distinction remains invisible to those who equate force with loss of humanity. The internal effects of this sustained compression are profound. Scott's identity fuses almost entirely with function. The space between who he is and what he does collapses. This is not a psychological breakdown. It is a narrowing. He becomes increasingly difficult to reach because there is little excess left to engage. Every interaction is evaluated through consequence. Every concession through cost. The human residue that once softened his authority evaporates. This transformation unsettles allies more than enemies. Enemies expect force. Allies expect recognition. Scott offers neither reassurance nor confession. He offers stability. To those craving moral affirmation, stability feels insufficient. It feels cold. The emotional economy of leadership breaks down. Gratitude does not circulate. because it would imply endorsement. Criticism does not deter because it does not alter threat calculus. At this stage, the figure of Cyclops becomes almost abstract. He is less man than position, less individual than function. This abstraction intensifies hatred. People do not rage against systems easily. They rage against faces. Scott becomes the face of a reality they cannot dismantle without risking extinction. Hatred condenses around him because he absorbs what the system refuses to integrate. The symbolic convergence with Magneto reaches its peak here. Not because Scott adopts Magneto's ideology, but because both occupy the same structural role in opposing narratives. Each becomes the embodiment of force that resolves ambiguity. The difference between them remains ethically significant, but symbolically marginal. To observers, both represent the collapse of moderation. Scott recognizes this and does not contest it. He understands that symbolism follows outcome, not intention. The cost of this recognition is isolation that cannot be shared. Scott no longer debates his path because debate presumes alternatives that still preserve survival. He sees fewer such alternatives each day. The field narrows. Choices compress. Leadership becomes trivial. This is where tragedy enters not as emotional crescendo, but as structural inevitability. Scott is not doomed because he chose wrongly. He is doomed because he chose it all. The consequences ripple outward. Younger mutants grow up under a different sky. For them, Scott's leadership is not aberration but norm. Security precedes idealism. Preparedness precedes hope. The myth of integration loses centrality. Survival acquires moral legitimacy. This generational shift alarms those who remember a different dream. Scott sees it as adaptation rather than corruption. Opposition movements fracture under this pressure. Some radicalize further, convinced that Scott's dominance proves the impossibility of centralized leadership without tyranny. Others retreat into nostalgia, preserving symbols of an era that no longer maps onto reality. Neither posture alters the structural conditions Scott responds to. The arena remains hostile. The pressure remains constant. The final consolidation occurs quietly. Scott stops attempting to justify himself, even internally. The burden of justification dissolves under sustained necessity. He becomes the figure who acts because inaction costs more than misunderstanding. This does not make him invulnerable. It makes him unappealable. Appeals require shared ground. That ground has eroded. By the end of this phase, the conflict is no longer dynamic. It is sedimented. Positions harden into identity. Scott is fixed as antagonist in narratives that require one. He is fixed as protector in narratives that prioritize survival. The gap between these readings becomes unbridgeable because each rests on incompatible valuations of risk and responsibility. The tragedy is not that Scott loses support. It is that support becomes irrelevant. The system now moves according to pressures larger than consensus. Scott stands at the center not as tyrant or savior, but as weight-bearer. He absorbs consequence so that others can continue arguing about ideals. The third phase closes with clarity that does not comfort. The conflict has completed its transformation from disagreement into structure. Scott Summers has not simply chosen a side. He has become the axis around which the entire moral terrain rotates. What follows is not escalation. It is legacy. Once the conflict hardens into structure, its meaning escapes the boundaries of the narrative itself. Scott Summers stops functioning solely as a character within a story and begins operating as a symbolic mechanism through which audiences process anxiety about power, leadership, and moral responsibility under threat. The debate around Cyclops is no longer about what he did, but about what his existence permits others to avoid confronting. Culturally, Scott occupies an uncomfortable territory. He is not charismatic enough to be admired uncritically, nor monstrous enough to be dismissed outright. He refuses both redemption arcs and villain spectacles. This makes him resistant to narrative consumption. Stories prefer figures who clarify moral space. Scott destabilizes it. He forces the audience into the same position as the characters around him, compelled to evaluate consequence rather than intention. The hostility toward Cyclops reflects a deeper discomfort with functional authority. Modern mythologies often celebrate rebellion, individuality, and expressive authenticity. Scott represents the opposite impulse. He embodies duty without romance, sacrifice without recognition, leadership without emotional catharsis. In a cultural environment that privileges visibility and effect, this reads as deficiency. He is experienced as emotionally opaque because he does not perform vulnerability on demand. This opacity becomes a screen for projection. Audiences map onto Scott their anxieties about institutions that claim necessity as justification. Military command, state surveillance, emergency powers. The language surrounding Cyclops mirrors real-world debates about security versus liberty. He becomes a proxy through which cultural fear of authoritarian drift is rehearsed, even when the narrative context repeatedly frames his actions as responses to existential threat. What complicates this projection is that Scott is rarely wrong in his assessments. Threats materialize. Delays cost lives. Idealistic restraint fails under pressure. The story refuses to grant easy refutation of his logic. This refusal generates cognitive dissonance. When a figure associated with harsh measures is consistently validated by outcomes, audiences are forced to choose between rejecting the character or reevaluating their assumptions about morality under crisis. Most choose rejection. Hatred becomes a way to preserve moral comfort. By framing Scott as emotionally deficient, rigid, or corrupted, the audience can dismiss his success as moral failure. This preserves the belief that goodness and effectiveness must align aesthetically. Scott disrupts that alignment. His victories feel wrong because they lack narrative warmth. They do not reassure. They merely persist. Symbolically, Cyclops functions as a wall. He absorbs impact so that the surrounding culture can continue imagining itself as humane. He becomes the necessary hardness that allows softer identities to survive without acknowledging their dependence on force. This is why gratitude rarely attaches to him. Gratitude would require recognition of complicity. Hatred preserves distance. The conflict also exposes how communities construct villains to stabilize identity. Scott's leadership threatens collective self-image. If survival required his choices, then prior ideals were insufficient. Rather than revise the ideal, the community externalizes discomfort onto the leader. Cyclops becomes the figure who broke the dream, even though the dream was already collapsing under external pressure. Media amplification intensifies this process. Simplified narratives reward moral clarity over contextual accuracy. Cyclops is flattened into iconography, visor and posture standing in for militancy. The complexity of his calculus disappears beneath the demand for symbolic villains. In this sense, the medium does not merely report the conflict. It completes it. Visibility transforms necessity into spectacle. Within the fictional universe, this amplification reshapes mutant identity itself. Younger generations inherit a mythologized version of the conflict. For some, Scott represents protection and preparedness. For others, he represents the loss of innocence. Both readings coexist, but they no longer communicate. Identity fractures along interpretive lines. Belonging becomes conditional on which version of Cyclops one accepts. This fragmentation mirrors real-world polarization dynamics. Figures who operate under crisis conditions often become symbolic magnets for incompatible narratives. They are read not for what they do, but for what they allow others to believe about themselves. Scott allows supporters to believe survival can be defended without apology. He allows detractors to believe morality must never adapt to threat. Both positions simplify reality. What makes Cyclops uniquely polarizing is that the narrative never fully endorses or condemns him. It refuses resolution. His leadership does not end the crisis. It manages it. This frustrates audiences conditioned to expect closure. Without catharsis, tension lingers. Scott's presence becomes an unresolved question embedded in the mythos. Symbolically, Cyclops stands at the intersection of power and accountability. He demonstrates that leadership under existential threat demands choices that erode moral purity. The cost of survival is contamination. The refusal to accept that cost does not prevent it. It merely shifts it onto those willing to bear it silently. Scott bears it. The hatred directed at him thus functions as moral displacement. By condemning Cyclops, the community absolves itself of responsibility for the conditions that necessitated his rise. He becomes scapegoat and shield simultaneously. Attacked publicly, relied upon privately. This dual role locks him into permanent antagonism. Culturally, Cyclops endures because he refuses to resolve into comfort. He is not an aspirational figure, nor a cautionary caricature. He is a reminder that under sufficient pressure, ideals alone fracture. Structures adapt or collapse. Someone must decide, and that someone will not be loved. The symbolic meaning of Cyclops is not that he was perfect. It is that he exposed the limits of collective innocence. He revealed that moral frameworks designed for stability do not scale cleanly into survival scenarios. This revelation unsettles audiences because it implicates them. It asks what they would preserve when time runs out. Most stories allow audiences to imagine they would choose well. Cyclops denies that fantasy. He suggests that choosing at all carries irreversible cost. This suggestion is intolerable to cultures invested in moral self-clarity. Hatred becomes defense. In this way, Scott Summers transcends his narrative role. He becomes a contemporary myth about leadership without consolation, a figure who absorbs the weight of history so others can argue about its meaning. His conflict with everyone is not personal. It is structural, and that structure does not disappear when the story ends. It settles. What remains after the conflict is not peace, nor resolution, but a new terrain shaped by pressure. Scott Summers does not exit the narrative cleansed or condemned. He remains embedded in its foundations, like a load-bearing wall that cannot be removed without collapse. The system that opposed him continues to exist only because it adapted around the choices he made. This is the paradox at the heart of his legacy. The future survives while refusing to thank the architecture that kept it standing. Cyclops leaves behind no doctrine, no manifesto, no clean philosophy others can inherit without friction. What he leaves is posture, a way of standing inside catastrophe without retreating into illusion. This posture is uncomfortable because it cannot be aestheticized. It offers no language of redemption, no promise that the damage incurred will be healed by intention alone. It simply holds, and holding over time reshapes everything around it. In the aftermath, attempts are made to rehabilitate older myths. Xavier's dream is invoked as if repetition could restore its original conditions. But the dream now exists in altered territory. The ground has shifted. Its language sounds thinner. not because it was false, but because it was incomplete. Scott's legacy forces recognition that ideals untested by collapse do not disappear, they deform. They must be rebuilt under weight, or they become relics. For some, Scott's era becomes cautionary tale, a warning about what happens when leaders abandon moral performance for operational necessity. These narratives preserve comfort by framing the period as deviation rather than adaptation. For others, Scott becomes foundational, proof that survival requires clarity without reassurance. These interpretations harden into cultural memory, each reinforcing different identities, neither able to fully dislodge the other. What matters is that Scott's presence permanently alters the moral geometry of the world. Leadership can no longer be imagined as purely persuasive. Power can no longer be disavowed as inherently corrupt when exercised under threat. The community loses the ability to pretend that restraint alone guarantees virtue, that innocence does not return. It cannot. Once a system has seen what it takes to endure, it cannot unknow that knowledge. Scott himself does not emerge triumphant. He emerges intact, which is different. His interior world remains narrow, shaped by years of compression. He does not receive narrative reward because reward would imply closure. There is none. The cost he paid cannot be refunded by acknowledgement. The losses incurred cannot be balanced by gratitude. He carries forward as function, not symbol. Others may argue about meaning. He ensures continuation. The hatred does not fade. It calcifies. Over time, it becomes tradition. New generations inherit opinions about Cyclops before understanding the conditions that produced him. This is how myths stabilize. Complexity erodes into stance. Scott becomes reference point rather than subject. But even as nuance thins, his structural impact remains. Every future crisis measures itself against his choices, even when denying that lineage. What makes Scott Summers endure is not that he was right in every decision. It is that he accepted being wrong in ways others refused to risk. He stepped into ambiguity when the system demanded clarity. He chose action when inaction preserved moral comfort at lethal cost. His legacy is not moral certainty. It is responsibility without spectacle. The final shape of his myth is unsettling because it resists reconciliation. Cyclops does not return to the fold. He does not soften into mentor or martyr. He remains the figure who stood where the ground was weakest and refused to step aside. This refusal anchors the narrative long after events fade. It leaves behind a question that cannot be dismissed. What does leadership owe when survival itself is at stake? Scott Summers offers no answer that soothes. He offers an example that persists. A reminder that someone must hold the line when ideals fracture, and that the one who does will be opposed not because they failed, but because they succeeded in exposing what everyone else preferred not to see. The conflict never ends. It becomes identity,